In a year where we've been pretty much starved for decent shooters, along comes Necromunda Hired Gun, a fast-paced, violent and thrilling FPS set in the 40k universe. It's one of the few games I've been looking forward to all year, and now it's also one that's left me a bit confused as to just how I feel about it. After spending 10 hours with this thing, at which point I really do feel like I've seen all there is to see here, I don't think I'd say that I hate Necromunda, but I definitely didn't love it either. There's definitely some decent gunplay in here and some cool action to be had, but let's not mince words. This is a very janky game. It's at times loose, sloppy, and it just kind of feels borderline unfinished. And it's also got a story that's poorly told and not very captivating. Hey! All the same though, let's deep dive into the Hive City and see why that is, shall we? Right, well if nothing else, Necromunda does run pretty damn well, and it also looks great at times. There's some highly detailed looking areas in this game with nice lighting and these large expansive environments to move through. It also makes use of Nvidia's DLSS technology, so if you've actually got an RTX card, you're gonna get some pretty stable frame rates, which is handy considering how over the top the action can be at times. Aside from that, I think you can genuinely tell that the people who made this have a lot of love for the source material. This thing's been developed by the same guys who made Space Hulk Deathwing, and much like that game, it also takes place in a lot of mostly interior, metallic looking environments, where the air probably smells like stale farts. My interest in 40k pretty much begins and ends with that Space Marine game that came out back in 2011, but you don't need to be that much of a staunch fan of the series to appreciate how much effort has gone into making this world come to life.
And what nightmares may come in these hive cities.
Sadly, that's where the positives end with this thing though, because for the vast majority of the time here, you're going to be in combat, and at that point, it really looks like what I could best describe as visual diarrhea. It's just this obnoxious smorgasbord of particle effects, perspective warping and poor animations that ends up just being completely disorienting and often downright painful to look at. There's an epilepsy warning when you first launch the game, and yeah, they're not kidding. I think I actually got epilepsy from playing this. But I might be getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about the story and the premise first.
I figured you were gonna say that.
Right, so in this you're playing as some kind of nameless bounty hunter. It even lets you choose what your character looks like from a bunch of preset appearances, which is kind of odd considering it's a game that you play entirely in first person mode. Then starts off with a prologue where you and a couple of other people are hunting down a contract, only for the whole thing to go pear-shaped and then something mildly exploding before your character passes out or something.
Looks like you chose the wrong side, scum.
Then after fading to black, you wake up in an underground settlement called Martyr's End, rescued by someone named Cal, who's apparently turned you into Adam Jensen while you're unconscious.
Enough of the riddles, Spire Boy.
Yeah, you've been given all of these cybernetic upgrades and enhancements, which is cool, but this all happened off screen, and it kind of seems like a bit of a wasted opportunity to not have shown this.
There's time for all that later.
Remember in Deus Ex how you had that really cool opening sequence showing Adam being put together again by all the king's horses and all the king's men? Yeah? Well, there's none of that here. From this point on, it's all just about taking on a single mission, one after the other, which sends you off to an entirely different area, all of which are just pretty linear though, as you move through them fighting wave after wave of bad guys until the whole thing ends. After that short prologue sequence though, I pretty much had no idea what the hell was going on, or what I was even supposed to be doing. Characters are often introduced in such a rushed manner during cinematics, and they often disappear just as quickly. And the advancements with the story consist of little more than just standing in one place and listening to people talk.
Really?
There's only really 3 characters you talk to in this main hub, and aside from a couple of vendors, you just move back and forth between each of them, listening to dialogue before you can then begin the next mission.
You figured it right out.
They never move around, they're never animated or doing something unique, they're just kind of standing there in their designated spot.
Yes, no doubt about it now.
In a universe that seems teeming with possibilities and offers up these vast, expansive areas to explore, the limited scope of only 3 people to talk to just seems so boring in comparison.
That might be the quickest I've seen anybody work that out.
What I also noticed pretty early on too was that almost all of the characters you talk to either have masks on or something covering their face, which is either some kind of commentary on the current state of the world and all these COVID restrictions, which is highly unlikely, or more so just because they were too lazy to animate the lip syncing, which is highly likely.
I will if I have to.
Apart from that too, the writing is just weird, man. The dialogue is really bizarre and the audio is often not mixed properly,
Who told you that?
with voices being drowned out by the background music.
Indeed.
And because 9 out of 10 characters in this game have something covering their mouth, half the time I couldn't even understand what the hell they were saying. Yeah, thank God for subtitles.
Yes, so they would say. It's an outrage.
The cinematics are really sloppy too, and I don't even know what's supposed to be going on with this one. It's one of the few times you actually see your character from a third-person perspective, and yet for this whole cinematic he's got his back to the camera. Which again just kind of makes me think even more that they did this so they wouldn't have to animate anyone's lips moving.
Hey! Hey!
But I know what you're thinking, none of that matters, right? It's all about the gameplay. Well, I guess if nothing else, it's definitely fast-paced.
Hey! Hey!
There's so many mobility options here, and it's definitely a highlight of the combat loop, in the way that you can kind of zip all over the place so quickly. It's really only limited by your own capabilities. Still though, it does feel like it hasn't been used to its full potential. Wall running, for instance, is in the game because it seems every FPS that comes out lately just has to have this, along with including sliding, dashing, and double jumping. The only problem is that there's just so few times when wall running is actually woven into the level in a way that makes it feel seamless. The only way you'll do this is if you go out of your way to do it. When you wall run, your weapons kind of snap onto enemies and you become much more accurate, which is about the most obvious pandering to people playing with a controller I think I've ever seen. And yeah, look, it does feel cool, but like I said, there's just so few instances when you can put this to good use. Dashing is also in the game, but you can only dash left, right, and backwards, not forwards. If you try to dash forward, you're gonna slide. You have to jump first, and then you can dash forward. Sliding would have been cool too, except the sliding speed is absolutely laughable. It's not affected by the gradient either. That is to say, if you're sliding down a hill, the sliding isn't going to last until the terrain levels out. So about the only thing that I think they got right here is the double jumping and the grappling hook. Early on in the game you get a grappling hook, and this might be the coolest mechanic in your arsenal because you can pretty much grapple anywhere. Yeah, see that mountain? You can grapple up that. It can also be used to grab the shield out of an enemy's hand, which kinda looks pretty basic. Like, the enemy doesn't even flinch or react to this, there's no sign of struggle or resistance, it just kinda flies out of their hand and then disappears. But combined with that double jumping, these both actually work pretty well and they give you a great amount of freedom with your movement. And it also helps that whenever you're using these abilities, it makes you much harder to hit. So as a guy who really likes being able to move around and go wherever I want to, this does at least offer up a lot of options in that regard. Even if, like everything else in this game, it does also feel kind of loose and janky. And yeah, the jank, we'll get to that soon enough.
Then you'll have to kill me to get it.
The other thing that got marketed pretty heavily with this, relatively speaking, was the fact that you've also got your very own attack dog at your side constantly. Well, on cooldown anyway. But this is yet again another mechanic that doesn't feel like it's been utilized to its full potential. You ever play that old arcade game called Shadow Dancer? It's a pretty cool game that came out back in the 80s where you had a pet wolf, and all you had to do was press a single button and your wolf could go off and attack enemies. And now, here we are, over 30 years later, and pretty much nothing's been done to improve upon that. You still just press a single button to use this thing. In fact, that's not actually correct. You gotta press a button once to spawn it in, then another button to send it off and attack enemies. Because if you don't tell it to attack anyone, it just kind of stands around doing nothing. I mean, if it started licking its own balls at that point, it wouldn't surprise me. Now at first, this poor thing doesn't look all that threatening, and it is a little bit juxtaposed with the grungy and futuristic world of Necromunda, but you can eventually give this thing some pretty gnarly looking upgrades. Even after upgrading it though, which turns it into something that a T800 could have as a house pet, it's still kind of underwhelming.
Oh shit!
And you've just got such a basic control over it. It's either attack something or don't attack. And I just never thought the concept of a cyber mastiff could somehow be so boring, but yet here we are. The only objectively useful skill this thing has is highlighting enemies, but the bare bones nature of its other abilities, combined with the fact that there's friendly fire and you can actually damage it, just makes this poor guy a bit forgettable. And yes, before you ask, you can pat him. Finally, we get to the actual shooting side of the combat, and honestly, I'm still trying to decide if this is the good kind of jank or the bad kind. Either way though, this combat system really does feel like the developers have just flung a heap of shit at a wall and hoped some of it sticks. Necromunda's got a whole heap of different weapon types like pistols, shotguns and scoped rifles, but a decent automatic weapon's more than enough to carry you throughout the entire game. In fact, I pretty much used the same automatic rifle I had early on in the game, up until I replaced it with a bolter, and even then they were pretty much the same in terms of up until I replaced it with a bolter, but even then they were pretty much the same in terms of damage output. Maybe the shotguns are good, maybe the sniper rifles are good too. To be honest, I never found out, mostly because I never needed to. If a weapon doesn't seem to have any weaknesses, well, then what reason is there for me to try out anything else? The other reason you don't need to mix up weapons all that much is because from start to end, it's really just the same roster of 3 or 4 different enemy types used over and over. And again, if the enemy types don't seem to change at all, well, then neither do your strategies need to. Some of them might have energy shields, but that's about it. It's really just boring, run-of-the-mill stuff. Trading shots back and forth with hit scanners who kind of peck away at your shield and health bar from the other side of the room. There's occasionally these big mech suit things you gotta take down, which are just bullet sponges. You don't really need to learn any new skills to beat them, they're just bigger enemies with a bigger hitbox and more health points. Same thing with the bosses, man, they're just the standard enemies with a lot more health points. Even the final boss is just derivative of enemies you've fought countless times before. Yeah, because heaven forbid, they actually create some unique and enjoyable boss fights. I think you come up against the Gene Stealers in maybe a single mission, but that's about it. And honestly too, it wouldn't even surprise me at this point if they just reused the same models from Space Hulk Deathwing. The Steam store page says the game offers up endless augmentation possibilities, which to be honest is just complete horseshit. There's literally only 8 abilities in the game, 2 of which aren't even combat based, so no, it's hardly endless. These are pretty fun to play with though, I won't lie. You can heighten your reflexes and slow down time. You can shoot out little energy balls that target multiple enemies. You can even teleport into enemies and explode. Gotcha, bitch. There's even one that turns you into Robocop, putting all of these auto-aim reticles across the screen and aimbotting everything.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
By far the most broken ones, where you go into this berserk mode and pull out a knife, running around at supersonic speeds and able to one-shot almost everything, with either a swipe of the knife or a kick of the mighty boot. But this ability is so overpowered that, ironically, it's actually not all that fun to use. Even with all of these abilities though, Necromunda is a pretty tough game. I played this thing on hard mode, and although the first couple of missions weren't too bad, the difficulty does ramp up exponentially as you progress into the campaign. You've got a shield and then your health points, and once they're both gone, you drop like a bag of shit. One of the ways to heal in this game is by using medkits, of which you can only ever have 3, but apart from that, the real main way to heal is by damaging enemies after they've hit you. Yeah, once you take a hit from someone, you've got a couple of seconds to attack back to then regain a chunk of health. What they're trying to do here is to force you to play super aggressively, because if you hang back and hide from everything, well then you won't be able to regain any health points. But it's also kind of stupid, because to heal yourself, you have to be hurt in the first place.
Yeah, I was worried about that.
So it's kind of dumb, because you're not this agile mobile assassin flying around the place unscathed, you're just a human-sized bullet magnet. It's kind of like the health regeneration system in Outriders, but somehow done even worse, and yeah, now I'm using Outriders as a positive comparison to this thing. That's how bad it is.
Yeah, I was worried about that.
It's really just a band-aid though on the gushing wound that is this game's damage scaling and balancing, and don't expect any kind of fair or balanced encounters here. They're so often sudden and unexpected, leaving you wondering just what the fuck it was that hit you. Overall, the tone of the whole thing kind of reminds me a lot of Rage 2, with that very similar grungy punk aesthetic, only it's nowhere near as fun or visceral. Like this teleporting ability, for instance, it's not all that exciting or visually interesting. You just kind of teleport right in front of someone in an instant and then hold your palm out before they explode. This other one's called Pulse, which fires out an AoE blast, and you're supposed to use this one against the enemies with shields to break it and make them vulnerable. But again, it's just not very exciting to use. These abilities can be bound to hotkeys, but even then, despite what buttons I allocate them to, I had a lot of instances when they just didn't seem to work. And I still had to go through this radio wheel manually to select whichever one I wanted. Whether or not this is a bug, I've got no idea. But the real question is, why bother with any of that, when you can just run right up to someone and press the interact button to perform an instant takedown? Remember that video that came out a bunch of years ago where someone's running through Rogue Warrior, just abusing the takedowns and slitting the throats of enemies back to back, or throat to throat? Yeah, well, this is the same thing in Necromunda, and it's really laughable at just how viable this is. In fact, at certain times, I was only able to get through some of these tougher areas by spamming this thing over and over. The reason for this being so effective is because while you're taking someone else out, the rest of the bad guys all just seem to patiently wait for their turn. And on the off chance that they actually attack you, well, it doesn't do damage anyway. I mean, just look at this. It's a fucking mess. It'd be like playing Doom Eternal and just being able to glory kill whenever you want to. But at least in Doom Eternal, you'd have to weaken an enemy before you could do it. Here though, you can just walk right up to most of the enemies at any point and do this. So yeah, I'm sure I could throw grenades at these enemies or use my pulse to take their shield off, or I can just walk right up to them and press the E button and save myself the hassle. Am I starting to prove my point here? How this thing comes across as feeling sloppy and unfinished? I hope so.
They know precisely what they're doing.
To me, this thing often feels more like a mod than a standalone game. It's like one of those really broken mods that someone would make for Half-Life 2 or something, that adds in a bunch of new abilities and weapons for the player to bugger around with. Just without any sense of how they're all going to work together, with the concept of balancing thrown out the window.
No.
It also lacks a lot of quality of life features to the point that it's almost like the developers have had tunnel vision or something and haven't played any other game that was made in the past decade.
What happened?
I mean, for instance, there's not really any kind of tutorial or explanation for any of the abilities you get in the game. You get a brief rundown of those basic ones in the opening mission, but then there's all the rest of them that you can only unlock if you've got the cash. And the game doesn't really make any attempt to try to explain them outside of some basic text and a tiny example video. It just leaves them all tucked away inside all of these vendor screens. In fact, I only found out after 3 or 4 missions that I could even upgrade the dog here. But then it's also missing basic features that you'd kind of expect in a game like this.
Those dumb Orlocks!
I mean, something as simple as not being able to see gun stats when you loot item crates. You know how in like every single looter shooter ever made, how when you open a chest, the weapon stats come up so you can decide if you want to use that current weapon? Well, that simple convenience is apparently too much for the developers to have included.
Those dumb Orlocks!
I wouldn't call Necromunda an outright looter shooter, but you do come across new weapons frequently, and not being able to see their basic stats at a glance just seems like a huge oversight. That pales in comparison to the fact that there isn't even an inventory screen. Yes, you heard that right, there's no inventory screen.
Really?
At no time can you go into a menu and have a look at all of the weapons and items you've got equipped. I mean, did they just forget to add this one in? The closest you get is before each mission you can select your loadout, and when buying new weapons you can see the stats of whatever you've got equipped, but that's about it. But at no time can you just press the tab button and bring up like a rudimentary screen that's going to show how much cash, weapons and items you've got. Then there's all of the weird glitches like animations not working properly and having you teleport all over the place. Or things like enemies just standing in place because their AI's not working. It's kind of going back to what I was saying earlier too, how I'm not sure if this is the good or the bad kind of jank. Look, I understand that this is a small indie team working on this thing, and they're not going to have super polished gameplay, so I almost kind of feel like it's a case-by-case situation as to whether or not this kind of thing is going to bother people.
Last chance!
When you finish the main campaign, which took me the better part of 6 hours to get through, you can then take on all these repeatable side missions, which just sends you back to areas you've already explored to raise your standings with a couple of dozen factions, one at a time. But again, I mean, is there really any point to this? I mean, you can level up and acquire better guns, but it's not like there's any co-op mode or super hard raids to complete. You're really only unlocking new gear to impress yourself, so what's the point? It'd be like masturbating while looking at yourself in the mirror and then complimenting yourself on your own form.
Really?
There's not much variety to these side missions either. It's mainly just hunting down a specific bounty, destroying a bunch of robots or capturing control points. The control point ones are the worst. It takes so long to capture a single point and you have to frequently move out of the radius to attack enemies and get your health back. some of them are just outright broken. One of them, you're supposed to be freeing these captives from some kind of containment tube, and although there was a giant interact prompt in front of these things, I couldn't find anywhere that I was actually supposed to interact with them. I don't know if this was a bug or something I was missing, but I didn't even have time to check, because I was constantly being attacked by the same enemies that kept spawning in. You can't even abandon these missions and return to the hub. You've got to quit out to the main menu and then load the game in again, losing whatever loot you've got in the process. So yeah, that's fun. And again, I do understand how some people might defend all of this because it's made by a smaller team, but to be honest, I don't really buy into that whole argument to defend games like this. That's kind of an insult to the smaller dev teams putting out genuinely high quality titles. I'm sure 40k fans are going to enjoy running around and shooting these recognisable factions in the face with a bolter, and I won't lie, the combat does have its moments. But I can't help but feel that this is another one of those instances when we're getting a game that's really only 80% finished.
You figured it right out.
And it wouldn't surprise me if in the next couple of months, the quality of this thing improves dramatically. Right now though, to be honest, it's a bit of a hard sell. It's at least not full price though, which is helpful, but still recommending a game like this that still feels so loose and unrefined is kind of like trying to sell coal at a diamond store. I didn't really like Space Hulk Deathwing that much, which was another game that these devs worked on, and honestly that should have been enough to let me know before I even touched this one that I probably wouldn't have liked this one either. But I thought I'd at least give them a second chance. Unless they can tidy this thing up though over the next few months, well, I don't think there'll be a third.